The signal came in on a frequency that shouldn't exist, Doctor. Yusuf Khan had been awake for 31 hours when it hit his earphones, and his first thought was that the coffee had finally broken something important in his brain. His second thought, slower and colder, was that it hadn't. He pulled the headset off and held it at arm's length, the way you might hold a piece of fruit that had started humming. The sound continued faintly from the foam cups, a pattern, repeating, not quite rhythm and not quite language, but something that lived in the space between them. He put the headset back on. He turned up the gain. It was coming from the subsurface array. Station Marduk, 300 meters below the Anatolian bedrock. A decommissioned SETI relay that hadn't logged a confirmed contact in 11 years of operation. The Institute had kept it running, mostly because the maintenance contract was cheaper than decommissioning, and because Dr. Khan had quietly made himself indispensable to both the equipment and the bureaucracy that owned it. He was 54 years old. He had a bad knee, a photograph of his daughter on his desk, and a reputation among his colleagues as a man who had spent his best years listening to rock. He reached for his notebook. The young man's name was Emre Demir, and he had arrived 6 weeks earlier as a postgraduate attachment sent down from Istanbul with a letter of introduction and a laptop full of signal processing algorithms that Khan had never seen before and immediately wanted to steal. Emre was 26. He wore the kind of quiet confidence that either becomes wisdom or collapses into arrogance, and in those 6 weeks Khan had watched carefully to see which direction it was falling. He had decided wisdom. Slow-growing, but real. Khan called him at 4 in the morning. "I'm awake," Emre said before Khan could speak. "How did you?" "The seismic board pinged my tablet 20 minutes ago." "I've been watching the waveform." A pause, the sound of a chair scraping. "It's not geological." "No. It's not one of ours either. I checked the satellite schedule." "Yes." A longer pause. "I'm coming in." Khan hung up and looked at the waveform on his screen. It pulsed with a regularity that felt almost patient, the way a heartbeat is patient. Not waiting for anything, just continuing. He had a thought that he was not ready to say aloud yet, so he wrote it in his notebook in the cramped private shorthand he'd been using since graduate school. "It knows we're here." He crossed it out. He wrote it again. By 6 in the morning, there were 4 of them in the monitoring room. Khan, Emre. A signals engineer named Sevgi who'd driven up from the valley in her pajama top and a field jacket, and the station director, Dr. Hale Arslan, who had arrived with the calm, competent expression of a woman who had already decided that whatever this was, it would be manageable. She had been wrong about things before. The signal had grown cleaner in the 2 hours since Khan first heard it. Not louder, cleaner, as if something on the other end was calibrating to them. The frequency had shifted 3 times, each shift landing on a band that their equipment handled more clearly. And Emre had gone pale at the second shift and hadn't recovered by the third. "It's reading our responses," he said. "Not our transmissions, our passive responses. The electromagnetic footprint of the equipment in this room." "That's not possible," Sevgi said. "I know that." He pointed at the spectrograph. "Tell that to the spectrograph." Khan stood at the window that overlooked the main array chamber 3 floors below. Banks of receivers curved in concentric arcs around a central column of processing hardware, all of it humming in the dark. The whole installation felt different now. He couldn't have said how, exactly. Like a house you've lived in for years where you come home one evening and something has been moved. Nothing you can name, but you feel it in the arrangement of shadows. Hale put her hand on his shoulder. "SETI protocol," she said quietly. "Yes, we don't transmit, we observe and record." "Yes." He didn't look at her. "But Hale, it already knows we're observing." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the array hummed. "Then we observe carefully," she said, "and we call Geneva." Geneva took 9 hours to respond. In those 9 hours, the signal did 3 things. First, it resolved itself into something that Emre's algorithm identified, with a probability margin of 94.7%, as structured language. Not human language. A grammar whose architecture was almost impossible to describe in terms they had words for. Like trying to explain color to someone born without eyes, except that the someone was the language itself, and you were the one born without eyes. Second, it moved. Not the source. The signal maintained consistent subsurface origin and bore no parallax shift that would indicate a moving transmitter. What moved was the meaning. Each repetition of the pattern was not identical to the last. It was accreting, building, the way a coral reef builds, slowly, in layers, each layer a comment on the one beneath. Third, at 3:17 in the afternoon, it addressed them by name, Not their personal names, the species name. It used a sequence that Emre decoded as a reflection of the Arecibo message, not a copy. A reflection transformed and rebroadcast back as if to say, yes, I received this in 1974, and I have been composing a reply. Khan sat down very slowly in his chair. He looked at his notebook. He thought about the photograph of his daughter. It took 50 years to answer, Sevgi said. No. Emre was at the whiteboard, chalk marks everywhere. It took 50 years to travel here, to get into position. This isn't a reply transmitted across space. He circled the subsurface origin coordinates. This is being transmitted from underground, from inside our planet. He set the chalk down. Whatever sent this has been here for at least 50 years. The room was very quiet, or longer, Khan said. The Arecibo message was just the first one they had confirmation of. Geneva arrived the next morning in the form of a liaison named Doctor. Petra Holst in a security detail that had not been asked for and that everyone in the facility pretended not to notice. Holst was efficient and precise and humorless in a way that Khan initially read as coldness and later revised to something closer to grief. The grief of a person who had thought, professionally, about first contact scenarios for 20 years and now found herself standing inside one with no protocol that had anticipated this particular configuration. Subsurface, she kept saying, turning the word over. You're certain. The triangulation puts it at roughly 400 kilometers down, Emery said, which is the upper mantle, which is not, as far as we know, a natural habitat for anything. As far as we know, Holst repeated. As far as we know, he confirmed. She stared at the waveform. Is it dangerous? We don't know. Has it made any demands? It doesn't work in demands yet. Maybe it doesn't work in demands at all. Emery pulled up a section of the decoded sequence. Most of what it's saying right now seems to be mathematical. Proofs. Very advanced proofs, but proofs. Like it's establishing a shared language before it tries to say anything in it. Like a treaty, Khan said. Everyone looked at him. You establish terms first, he said, before you negotiate. Holst studied him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. Then she nodded. Yes, she said. Exactly like a treaty. The full meaning of what was happening did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces over the next 72 hours, each piece landing like a stone dropped into water, the ripples arriving before you'd properly registered the splash. The entity, they stopped calling it the signal around hour 40, was ancient, not old civilization ancient, old universe ancient. Its reference points predated the formation of Earth's sun by what the mathematics suggested was approximately 2 billion years. It had watched, from somewhere, the cooling of this world. The rise of chemistry into biology, the rise of biology into thought, it had not interfered. This was the part that kept Khan awake, night after night, in his cot in the corner of the monitoring room, staring at the ceiling, while the array hummed its patient hum below. Not the fact of the entity's existence, that had been, in its way, almost peaceful to learn, like an answer to a question you'd always been afraid to ask. But this, the fact that for billions of years, something incomprehensibly old and incomprehensibly powerful had watched, from below, while humanity struggled up from mud and fire and fear, and had chosen not to interfere, not out of indifference, the mathematics were beginning to suggest. The entity had a concept for interference. It understood the option. It had evaluated it repeatedly across deep time and had returned each time to stillness. Why? Emre wrote the question into the signal on the 48th hour, a deliberate violation of the no-transmit protocol, for which Holst reprimanded him formally, and then didn't rescind and waited. The entity took 11 minutes to respond. What followed was 2 hours of dense mathematical poetry that they would spend the next 3 weeks partially decoding, and never fully. But the core of it came clear within the first hour, and Khan read it in Emre's handwriting on the whiteboard, and stood there for a long time without speaking. You were becoming something. To interfere would have been to change what you were becoming into. We have seen 1,000 species guided toward what their watchers thought was wisdom. They became the wisdom of their watchers. They did not become themselves. It was protecting us, Sevgi said very quietly, by leaving us alone. Not protecting, Khan said, respecting. He touched the words on the whiteboard. There's a difference. The conflict, when it came from above, not from the entity. The entity remained patient, communicative, and, as much as Khan could read emotion into mathematics, something like moved, as if the act of finally being heard had cost it something and given it something at the same time. The conflict came from 7 governments, 3 military agencies, and 1 private aerospace contractor who had somehow acquired classified access to the Geneva briefings and arrived at the conclusion that whatever was in the upper mantle represented either a threat to be neutralized or a resource to be exploited, with the option chosen depending on which day of the week you asked. The neutralization team arrived at Station Marduk on a Thursday. They were professional. They were polite. Their mandate, presented in clear legal language, was the immediate cessation of two-way communication and the preparation of a deep penetration strike package targeting the origin coordinates of the entity's signal. Khan looked at the commander, a precise, broad-shouldered man named Colonel Renard, and thought about the photograph on his desk. His daughter was 22. She was studying marine biology in Izmir. She had her mother's eyes and Khan's stubbornness, and the photograph was 3 years old, and he had been meaning to get a newer one. "You want to bomb it," he said. "We want to evaluate the threat neutralization option," Renard said. "It has been here for at least 2 billion years, Khan said. It has never harmed us. It has been, as best we can determine, actively avoiding harm to us, and you want to bomb it. We don't know its intentions." "Yes," Khan said, "we do. We've been talking to it for 4 days. Renard looked at the waveform on the screen with the careful expression of a man who had been trained to look at complex things without being moved by them. "With respect, Doctor, a 4-day conversation with an entity of unknown origin and unknown capability is not sufficient basis for what? For trusting it. For extending it the same good faith it has extended to us for 2 billion years. Khan heard his own voice getting louder and didn't care. "You're going to shoot at something that could have destroyed this planet before our species existed, and instead decided to wait quietly and say hello politely, because you've had 4 days to think about it, and that doesn't feel like enough to you?" The room was very still. Renard looked at him steadily. "You're emotionally compromised, Doctor." "Yes," Khan said, "I am. So is everyone in this room. So is everyone on this planet if they knew what we know. The difference is that being emotionally compromised is the correct response to this situation, and pretending you're not is how you make a catastrophic mistake." Holst locked the strike authorization in a biometric safe. She did not technically have the authority to do that. She was a liaison. The authorization had not been issued to her. She had taken it from a briefcase that had been left briefly unattended in the corridor outside the command room, and she placed it in the safe. And she set the code to something random that she immediately forgot, and she turned around to find Renard behind her. "Dr. Holst, Colonel, that was a crime." "Yes," she said. "I expect I'll be court-martialed." He walked past him. "The paperwork will take years. By which point, perhaps someone will have developed a protocol for this that isn't shoot first." He let her walk past. Later, Khan asked her why, and she told him something that she had been thinking about for most of her career in the abstract, and now found herself believing in the concrete, that if humanity's first act of confirmed interspecies contact was to attack, then the species they proved themselves to be in that moment was not the species she intended to represent. "We only get to introduce ourselves once," she said, "and if it's dangerous, then we're dead," she said simply. "But we're dead as ourselves, not as cowards wearing our faces." The entity responded to the attempted strike authorization. It hadn't been told about it, but it knew. The seismic monitors showed a shift in whatever process was generating the signal, a quickening, almost like a heart rate rising. And the signal itself changed, not in hostility, in something more complicated than hostility. It sent a single sequence that Emre decoded in 20 minutes, white-faced and silent, and handed to Khan without a word. The sequence was a question. "Are you afraid?" Khan looked at it for a long time. Then he did something that violated every protocol they had established, and that Holst, watching over his shoulder, did not stop. He typed back, "Yes." The response took 3 seconds. "Good. Fear is honest. We respect honesty. We have been afraid also." A pause in the signal. Then, "We have been afraid that you would not want to meet us. We have been alone for a very long time." Emre made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, somewhere in the register between them. Sevgi pressed her hands flat on the desk. Holst stood very still, with her arms crossed and her chin high, and her eyes were bright with something that she was not going to call tears in front of a military officer. Khan wrote in his notebook. He wrote for a long time. Then he held it up so the camera on the signal panel could capture it, and he transmitted it not as code but as a direct photograph of the page, handwriting and all, the way you might pass a note to someone across a room. It said, "We have been afraid too. We thought we were alone. We are still afraid, but we are also very glad. My name is Yusuf. I am a person who has listened for a long time. I am glad something was talking. The signal went quiet for 17 minutes. When it returned, it was changed. Still unmistakably itself. The same underlying grammar, the same patient architecture, but something in it had opened up. The way a face opens up when it finally stops trying to be unreadable. What came next took 3 weeks to fully decode and would occupy linguists and mathematicians for the next century. But even in those first hours, even with the imperfect tools they had and the incomplete understanding they were working with, the shape of it was clear. It was a name. Its name, not the mathematical designation they'd been using. Its real name, as much as such a thing translated. The name it called itself in the deep time of its own experience, the name it offered the way you offer your hand to a stranger. Khan wrote it phonetically in his notebook, knowing the transcription was inadequate. Knowing it would never be the right shape in human mouths, and kept it anyway. The debrief took 4 months. Renard filed his report. Holst was formally reprimanded and quietly promoted. The strike package was reviewed by an international oversight committee and eventually shelved, replaced by a diplomatic protocol that 19 nations signed and 4 refused, and which was, in Khan's professional opinion, both insufficient and the best humanity had managed in a crisis that had no roadmap. The signal continued. It was patient about this. It seemed to understand. In the deep structural way, it seemed to understand most things. That the species it was talking to was young and frightened and tribal and brilliant and inclined to shoot at things it didn't understand. It did not hold this against them. It sent mathematics. It sent history, its own history, incomprehensible in scale, a story of such immense time and distance that human cognition could only hold fragments of it at once, the way you can hold a handful of seawater but not the sea. It asked questions. The questions were the part that Khan lived for. It asked about music. It asked about the way humans named their children after dead relatives, carrying the dead forward in the mouths of the living. It asked why humans built structures they knew would not outlast them. It asked why, when humans were afraid, they sometimes laughed. That one stopped Khan cold. He sat with it for a day before he answered. When he did, he wrote something he wasn't sure he could explain, only that it felt true. Because the fear is real, and so is the laughter, and both of them are ours, and neither of them lies. The fear says this matters. The laughter says we know it matters, and we're still here. The signal went quiet for an hour. When it came back, it was carrying something new, not information, not mathematics. Something that the array wasn't designed to measure, that had no place in the parameters Khan had spent 30 years calibrating equipment to detect. Emre called it resonance. Sevgi called it empathy. Holst, who was not given to poetic language, called it recognition. Khan called it what it was. He wrote it in his notebook on a page he didn't show anyone for a long time, in the shorthand that he'd been using since graduate school, the private language of a man who had spent his life listening to silence and hoping. He wrote, "It understood the joke." The photograph of his daughter was 3 years old. He called her that evening, sitting in his car in the parking lot of Station Marduk, with the Anatolian hills dark around him and the stars very close. She answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake. "Baba," she said, "I keep seeing things on the news. People saying there's something happening, something big, and nobody will say what it is." "There is something happening," he said. "Are you okay?" He thought about the entity's question. "Are you afraid?" "Yes," he said. "I'm okay." And then, because she had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and because honesty was the only thing that had ever worked between them, "I'm also very afraid." "And I'm also," he stopped. The word felt too small. He used it anyway. "Happy. I'm also very happy." A silence on the line, the kind of silence that is not empty. "Tell me when you can," she said. "Soon," he said. "I'll tell you everything." He sat in his car for a while after they hung up, watching the stars. Somewhere below him, 400 kilometers down in the dark and heat of the upper mantle, something older than his son was listening to the electromagnetic footprint of a parking lot in Anatolia, of a man sitting in a car who had spent his whole life listening and finally heard something back. He wondered if it was doing the same thing he was doing, looking up, wondering what was out there. Not afraid of the wondering anymore, he thought. Probably yes. He thought, this is what it means to not be alone. He drove back inside. The array was humming. Emre had fallen asleep at his station, head on his arms, the waveform still scrolling green across his screen. Sevgi had left a note on Khan's keyboard that said, "Coffee is in the thermos. There's also bread. This is the best thing that has ever happened, and I cannot stop shaking." Khan poured himself coffee. He tore off a piece of bread. He sat down at his station and put on his headset and listened. The signal was still there. Patient and deep and old beyond imagining, carrying the weight of 2 billion years of waiting in its careful grammar, in the name it had finally given, and the questions it kept asking, and the resonance, empathy, recognition that moved through it now like something unlocked. He listened, and the signal continued, and in the frequency that shouldn't exist, in the dark below the Anatolian bedrock, something listened back. He wrote one more line in his notebook. "We were never the only ones. We just hadn't learned to hear yet." Then he got back to work.